welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Economy Committee. Today's meeting's topic will be preparing London for exiting the EU. And we encourage anyone to take part in the discussion on social media by using the hashtags Assembly Economy and London after Brexit. First, we have a few short items that we've got a formal business that we've got to go through before we get to you guests, so if you can bear with us. Please can we make sure that electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions. Can I ask, are there any apologies today?
Thank you. We've received apologies for absence from Assemblymember Arnold and Assemblymember Twycross, for whom Assemblymember Cooper will be substituting.
Thank you. Can I ask members to note the list of appointments set out on item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? No. Can we agree the minutes from our last meeting held on the 23rd of May 2018?
Agreed.
Can we note the outstanding and completed list of actions?
Agreed.
Can we note the recent action taken by the former chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the response to the Mayor's draft culture strategy?
Agreed.
Thank you. So this brings us to today's main discussion item, preparing London for UK's exit from the European Union. Can I welcome guests? Ben Gardiner, Director of Cambridge Econometrics, Roger Bootle, Executive Chairman of Capital Economics. Lord Adonis is going to be late, I'm afraid, but hopefully not too late. And Dr. Gudgin, Economist, Centre of Business Research, Judge Business School, University of Cambridge. Welcome, gentlemen. So we're going to ask various questions, and welcome Liliane. We're just one member missing at the moment, but he shouldn't be too long. So if we can come to our first questions, and if I can start with you, Ben. Given what we know about the government's plan for leaving the EU, which scenario in the Cambridge Econometrics study aligns the closest to the deal the Prime Minister is hoping to secure with the EU?
Yes, okay, I've had a look at the 3 pages that have been released thus far, and without a proper white paper, I think it's difficult to say conclusively too much about it. If I just draw your attention to the slide on the scenarios, which I think is part of the pack. We did 5 scenarios, as explained, one of which is a kind of business as usual type thing if the referendum hadn't happened and things had continued more or less along trends of what they were following pre-2016. Then we did 2 kind of what you might call soft Brexit options, looking at either single market membership continuing or customs union membership continuing without the single market. And then the WTO rules, commonly known as the hard Brexit. Now, given that even in the 3 pages of the government's summary position, they're still talking about restricting movement of labour, this would tend to lead you down the line of saying, well, they're not going to continue membership of the single market because that violates one of the 4 fundamental freedoms, freedom of movement of people. Okay, so if you're ruling that out, then you're really looking at scenario 3, which is the customs union membership without the single market, which gives you obviously kind of free trade more or less with European Union members on manufactured goods, doesn't cover agriculture, doesn't cover services, and those are subject to secondary agreements, which we don't know much about. So, this is why when people sometimes commenting on our study say, why haven't you pursued the government's option? Well, one of it is because it was still very uncertain what the government's real option was, what their strategy was. The other one I won't go into now, but it was largely because of the speed with which we had to produce the study and having to rely on previous assumptions for trade barriers and non-trade barriers. So we basically took what was there in the literature in previous studies already and put those into our model. Now, those studies didn't consider the government's option, a Canada deal or anything like that, so we couldn't, in the time available, model anything like that. So anyway, to answer your question, I would say the closest one is probably scenario 3, which is more like the kind of Turkey model, if you like. Not turkeys for Christmas, but Turkey the country with this.
Can I go to the other gentleman? What are your views? Roger.
Well, it's very difficult to know where we are, isn't it? I feel I'm commenting in a vacuum, really, about something one doesn't even know exists. I think what appears to be the government's plan emerging from the Chequers agreement, if that's what it was, is about the worst of all possible Brexits, amounting virtually to a non-Brexit. We can, of course, analyse it in some detail and think through what the implications would be for London. I have to say, I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, we're in a situation where the politics is changing almost by the hour.
Susan, sorry, I don't normally sit on this committee. I don't understand why you say that that's a non-Brexit if we're leaving the single market and we're... I'm sorry, I don't quite understand why you said that.
Right.
Sorry
Well,
to interrupt.
thank you for interrupting me. If you look at what those people who were arguing for Brexit were asking for, and then examined this proposal, it doesn't really stack up very closely. We're leaving the single market. Are we leaving the single market? We don't properly know. At the moment, of course, we haven't seen the detailed white paper. This is one of the problems with this. We don't actually know the precise proposal. We don't know what the arrangements are going to be with regard to freedom of movement. There are questions to be raised about the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. There are issues about how able we would be to form free trade agreements with other countries around the world. Now, this goes right to the nub of the case for Brexit. If you asked any people, economists supporting Brexit, there were some, there were a lot, of course, opposing it, what is the nub of the argument for? Because obviously there are arguments for and against. And we know what the arguments are against. So if there were anyone, any economist, arguing for Brexit, what would they be saying was the nub of the argument for Brexit? I think they would mention two things. Freedom over trade policy, and therefore the ability to set our own tariffs and to negotiate free trade agreements around the world. Well, how well will we be able to do that? Negotiate free trade agreements around the world? Probably not very. And secondly, the freedom to diverge with regard to our regulations. Those are the nub, really, those two things. And that also is compromised by our accepting the single market customs union rules with regard to manufacturing and agriculture. So those are the reasons.
Okay, but we'll go back to the original questions because we're straying into two. I think we're going to do a lot of straying because of the subject matter. Graham, can I ask you what your views are?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I very much echo what Roger Bootle just said. I think the agreement, as far as we understand it, and as Roger said, we haven't seen the white paper yet, but as we understand it, is a long way from leaving the single market and the customs union. The single market is really two things. It's regulatory alignment. You have a common set of regulations for producers and consumers. But the EU insists all the time that a number of freedoms go with that free capital movement, and of course the important thing, freedom of movement. Now, what the Chequers agreement seems to be asking for is we'll have I think what they call a common regulatory framework, regulatory alignment.
Yep.
And they seem to be hoping that we'll get away with that without having to sign up to free movement. Because the EU has insisted at every stage in their famous no cherry-picking phraseology that you can't have that. You can't have the advantages of a single market without the freedom of movement. And there's been plenty of speculation in the press that the freedom of movement, the government will soften its stance on that. Perhaps with some sort of form of words that say, well, you won't be able, EU migrants won't be able to come into this country unless they already have a job. Which a huge majority of migrants who come in already have a job, so that would be no restriction at all. I mean, there's certainly a concern, I think, among a number of Brexiteer MPs that that's the direction of travel. So that if that is the direction of travel, then of course we would still be in the single market in all but name. The customs union, again, there's an attempt here. One of the things I think that's been driving the Prime Minister's desires on this is the need of particularly car and aircraft manufacturers not to have anything held up at the ports. They want their lorries to be able to come straight through. In the great majority of ports, there is no problem at all. We're probably only really talking about Dover, and I personally can't see why this can't be arranged without this huge transfer of policy sovereignty to the EU. The problem, I think, from many people's point of view, and I apologise if again it was straying into future questions, but the problem is that the UK is proposing to hand over to Brussels quite a significant proportion of its trade policy, its production regulations, its competition policy. And one thing that's hardly been commented on, but to me, as somebody who's worked in more disadvantaged regions much of my career of the UK, state aid policies. That means that Brussels will continue to tell the British government what is the most money you can spend on helping disadvantaged regions like the North East or Wales or Northern Ireland. And it's really very hard to see why on earth we would hand over all that policy. What is the gain? But to come back to your question, which of scenarios is closest here? I guess it's some amalgam of 3 and 4. But the difference is, by the way, perhaps should have said right at the beginning, I mean, to congratulate you on, on commissioning Cambridge Econometrics to do this. I think this is an excellent report and a very sensible model on which it's based. But we can see from the results that the impact of Brexit doesn't vary that much between scenarios. So I think perhaps some amalgamation of 3 and 4 might be it. We might take an average of the 2, but the 2 aren't very far apart anyway. So I'm not sure it matters. But we're certainly not talking about no deal, I think.
No.
Okay. Given that we don't have the white paper, given that things are up in the air a little bit, but the one thing we do have was Ben's original report. So I think there are varying views on your thoughts in the report that show the varying arguments from various sides. So if we stick in this section to really comments on your report, because then we have got 2 specific economic arguments for and against, and at least that's something we can look at, because who knows what's going to happen going forward. So at least we have a report in front of us that we have things that we can comment on. So on that basis, so if I ask you first, Ben, and then ask the other gentleman to comment, what does the report assume about the kinds of revised trade deals the UK will hope to secure with third countries once we're outside of the customs union with the EU?
The short answer is it doesn't assume anything. For the reason because there weren't any free trade deals that were being, it's all too uncertain to put in assumptions about, making a trade deal with China, making a trade deal with the US, all these kind of aspects. You could build them in, but how would you make your decisions about the assumptions you put into the model to make those changes for trade deals with the UK? We were very clear in our proposal for the work we did, which was to model the different options of Brexit in the terms of the scenarios I've outlined. Now, the only real free trade deals, I suppose, that could have been assumed would have been in scenarios 4 and 5, where you'd have left fully, in a sense, a more hard Brexit. Then we could have said, okay, let's add in a free trade deal with China, let's add in a free trade deal with such and such countries and so on. And this may have, would probably have kind of had a beneficial effect in the scenarios. But really there still is, there's nothing really concrete being put forward that would give you any certainty about the assumptions building. And I think, Graham, in your work, you didn't make any assumptions about free trade deals either. So you go with what you know as much as you can, which are the price effects, the trade barriers, the tariffs and non-tariff barriers, although the latter are incredibly difficult to deal with, how you deal with regulations and services and how those will impact on the economy. And given they're the largest part of London's economy, it's slightly worrying. But anyway, you deal with what you can, which is those trade assumptions, and you make judgments about investment, foreign direct investment, and also migration, which we did as well, which what was an advance on some of the models that had been previously out there on Brexit effects. But the flip side, well, there are opportunities for sure from Brexit in terms of freeing up new trade deals. Now, as Roger said, do we think that the UK stands a better chance of negotiating better deals with other countries, with third countries, than it would do separately as opposed to being part of the European Union? That's my judgment, I don't think they will. I don't think they can negotiate individually better than they can do as part of a massive trading bloc. Other people take different views. So it really, there's the kind of objective side of things, and then you kind of diverge into the subjective of what if, and could we do better in this scenario than that scenario. And in the time available and with the kind of boundaries put on the project, we didn't explore kind of third country wish lists, as it were.
Okay, I'll ask about assumptions because there are so many assumptions on so many other subjects.
Yes.
I wondered why on this particular subject. We can all make assumptions on something to prove the point that we want to make.
Some people do.
Yeah, that's right. And yet on this particular issue there wasn't assumptions in that in my view, just to balance it. So can I ask, gentlemen, what do you think?
Well, if I could start. It wasn't clear to me what some of the assumptions actually are. Under the WTO rules scenario, what are you assuming about the tariff rate that we are imposing on the rest of the world? Do we simply impose the current European Common External Tariffs?
Yes, we do.
Right. And with regard to...
There's no sorry to interrupt, there's no change in kind of treatment of other countries once we're outside the EU.
Well, there can't be any discrimination between countries, but you see, by making that assumption, you've immediately ruled out a key issue, which is what tariff policy do we pursue? Because it hasn't got to have the current tariff rates on the rest of the world. And if I also may ask, it's probably more profitable if I ask that.
It's interesting for us to
then I think there's the question of regulation. What are you assuming about the UK government's regulatory policy once it's got regulatory freedom, if indeed it does?
Yes. This again is a major issue when you come to particularly. The macro models can get away with it to some extent because they don't need to consider all the different sectors and the implications for them. And this is where we relied on the previous study, which was done by a Dutch consultancy, Economist, and they had previously constructed a set of tariff and non-tariff barriers. So in terms of increases in costs to trade that would occur through the different Brexit options, mainly WTO and the softer version. Now, the way they do this is they convert kind of non-tariff barriers, which are inherently non-price. You can't. They don't have a price attached to them, into price effects. Now it's contentious, but it is the kind of standard way of doing this in the kind of models that we use, and it's the same approach that the London School of Economics paper did, on which we kind of built our methodology as well. They use the same methodology. We use the same methodology. And because in the time available, again, I have to stress this was a 3-month study, we didn't have any other options to hand to do this. So it is a blunt instrument with which to assess the regulations on services. Absolutely. I fully accept that.
Well, you see, the reason I ask about these two things, as I said, these are the right with the nub of the case for leaving. And so if you make assumptions that amount to the status quo, you've immediately cut off at the legs the alternative view. Now, I understand that lots of other studies have done this, you're quite right, but this is piling Pelion upon Osler. The fact that, umpteen people have made inappropriate assumptions and come up with bonkers conclusions doesn't mean to say that, one should follow the same approach. Now, with regard to tariffs, there is the key question, just to emphasise this, as to what the UK's tariff policy would be. Just saying we're operating under WTO rules doesn't tell you what tariffs we choose. So we could choose to impose no tariffs at all. The thing is, you have to be consistent on the WTO rules, and this, it seems to me, would be the logical policy to follow. And you're then into the questions about what are all the gains that flow from tariff-free trade. So under this scenario, we could, for instance, declare zero tariffs on imports from everyone, the EU included. That's it, finish. Now, alternatively, we could get to a similar result by a process of negotiating free trade agreements, both with the EU and with the non-EU world. And it's a matter of tactics, I think, as to which way is best to try and get to that result. But the end result being one in which the tariff rates at the moment are in this world are lower than they are at present. You see, immediately what you do is you assume, okay, we leave the EU, we don't have an agreement with the EU, and we don't have free trade agreements in the rest of the world. Frankly, you don't need a very well-researched and extremely impressive big document to tell you that the UK is going to be worse off. I could tell you that straight away. Because what have you done? You've increased tariffs between the UK and the EU without any corresponding reductions elsewhere. And there are no deregulations either, you presume. So you're in exactly the same position as now, apart from the really big deterioration of your tariff regime, plus various questions about freedom of movement. So I think there are big questions, actually, about the assumptions made in this report. I accept the limitations of time, and it's certainly in common with a lot of other studies that have done the same sort of thing, including the Treasury, UK Treasury. On the subject of regulations, this is an horrendously difficult area because there are a number of things. First of all, what sort of, perhaps re-regulation is a better word than deregulation, frankly. What sort of re-regulations would be politically possible? We don't know. So that's one thing, what you can plausibly assume about what we do, because obviously we are still going to have regulations in all sorts of areas, just not necessarily the same as the EU ones. And then there's the question of how do you evaluate what their effect is. And frankly, in the literature, there's a vast discrepancy. Some people think that the cost of the existing regulatory regime is very small. Then you've got other people at the other end of the spectrum who think it's absolutely enormous. My own guess is actually somewhere in between those two extremes. But so, to emphasise my point, this is a legitimate way of proceeding, but in the process, some assumptions have been made which I think cut off at the knees the essence of the argument in the other direction. And therefore, I don't know whether we're going to get to that point, but there is, in other words, a perfectly plausible scenario, which ought to, I think, to be regarded and taken account of, under which tariffs in the rest of the world are lower. And briefly, just to finish, on your point about FTAs, what the chances are of Britain negotiating FTAs outside the EU, better than we'd have inside the EU. The conventional wisdom about this is, the EU's big, it's got clout. What little chance would poor little Blighty have in negotiating free trade deals if it managed to crawl out from underneath the EU's skirt? That's the conventional wisdom. And of course, as so often with the conventional wisdom, it happens to be complete and utter nonsense. Now, there's someone who's done a lot of detailed work on this, and it's not in your list of references, Michael Burridge. I don't know if you've seen his stuff, who's analysed in detail the FTAs that the EU has managed to conclude around the world. And the answer is very interesting. The EU has been a very bad negotiator of free trade agreements around the world. It hasn't got many. The ones it's got tend to be with really rather insignificant countries, including many of the European Union's former colonies, or its member countries' former colonies, and tend not to include services. There are plenty of examples around the world of small countries, including Singapore and Switzerland, which have negotiated far more and better free trade agreements. Now, why could this be, given the undoubted size and clout of the EU? There's one very simple explanation, which is, of course, that although the EU is big and it's got clout, it also consists of 28 member countries, and it's very difficult to get agreement between those 28 member countries. So it shouldn't be altogether surprising that a country like Singapore or Switzerland is better at negotiating free trade agreements than the EU is. So I think my conclusion is the UK would be more likely to conclude more and better free trade agreements outside the EU.
Have you got anything to add to that, Graham? And if I can ask you to keep it in as simplistic terms as you can, because whilst you completely understand what you're talking about, we're talking to an audience, hopefully, out there that might not understand FTAs, etc., etc. So if you can just try and keep the language as simple as possible, would be great.
Try that. Sorry, economists are terrible at this.
Don't worry, so is the rest of the world. Come to City Hall, we do 5-letter acronyms here, like nothing on earth. Makes 3-letter acronyms look simple.
We all think that ordinary people talk about nothing else over breakfast but GDP and something. Anyway, I think one of the great strengths of the Cambridge Econometrics model and their approach is that the relationships built into the model that they're very largely built on past data. They are anchored in reality. And strangely, that isn't the case in many other models. It's not what the Treasury now does. It's not what the Bank of England has ever done. That they're more theoretical. So I applaud this. But obviously, that sort of approach doesn't help you very much when you've got a unique event like Brexit, where we haven't got any data. No one's ever left the EU before. We don't really know what will happen with free trade agreements. I think Roger is right. You should make some allowance for free trade agreements, even if we don't know what they are. In my own modelling at Cambridge, we did try and do this. What we did was we assumed that the loss of trade with the EU on leaving, even with a free trade agreement, might be somewhere between 10 and 20% of exports. And that what would happen was that the UK would regain those exports in non-EU markets over a period of, say, about 20 years, a sort of slow recovery. Roger may argue, I know some of his colleagues argue, that we should quickly get rid of all tariffs and perhaps get a much sooner recovery than that. But anyway, if you do what we did, then actually the results up through the 2020s up to 2030 aren't very different from those of the Cambridge Econometrics study. It's really after that the gains tend to come in. But very few studies have looked beyond 2030, and I think we'd all agree that an awful lot will have happened by then. Perhaps an awful lot will have happened by tomorrow.
But that's the problem we've got at the moment, isn't it? Thank you. Just want to echo, because I think it's a very important point that Roger just made, and it really to disagree with Ben rather on this. People are always emphasising the size of the EU in getting free trade agreements. But Roger is quite right. The complexity of the EU makes it very difficult. Why do we have the EU, and therefore the UK at present, has an 11% tariff on most clothing? Why do we want to have a tariff on clothing? I forget what the tariff is on oranges, but perhaps about 20% or something. Why on earth do we want to charge consumers in the UK an extra 20% for oranges? Just protect the orange producers of Sunderland or something. So you can see what's happening here. The clothing tariffs are there essentially to protect small Italian producers, important clothing. The orange tariffs are there to protect the Spanish and Italians. If we try to negotiate our own free trade agreement, we can go to India and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and say, look, we'll take all tariffs off your clothing. At the same time, we would say to India, would you mind reducing your 150% tariff on Scotch whisky, which isn't helping Scotland very much. So we would have much more flexible bargaining power. So I think we would have free trade agreements. It may take some time to negotiate these, which is why we built in a 20-year sort of slow slide. Roger may be right that there may be quicker ways of doing it than that. But you should probably do something.
But over the time horizon we're talking about here, I'm not sure it makes a huge difference to the forecast, so I wouldn't worry about it just too much.
Okay, Leonie and then Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. So I just want to be absolutely clear that the difference between a free trade agreement, which would be when both sides agreed not to have tariffs, and deciding to just say that we're going to go tariff-free, that would be a sort of unilateral declaration of we're not going to have tariffs ourselves, so you can sell your things to us. So we could end up in that situation where we said no tariffs for anything coming into our country, but we would still have those tariffs externally applied. So, one question I have is, isn't that why then people go into the negotiations, even if it takes a bit longer, so that both sides sort of agree to drop their tariffs at the same time? And secondly, this is all in the context of someone who is coming here on Friday, who seems to be rather keen to massively increase tariffs. And one of the things that a lot of people are talking about with some enthusiasm since the referendum in 2016 was the idea that we might be able to enter into some very advantageous free trade deals or no tariff deals with the United States of America. Now, that doesn't seem to be the sort of mood music emanating from President Trump. So I just wondered, does that actually seem likely, or do you think it's better for us to look elsewhere around the world? I think Roger's mentioned India, and I think Graham Graham mentioned India, and I think we were talking about mentioning China. And finally, the other point about the number of members of the EU, it hasn't always been 28. Was there a time when it was smaller, when more free trade agreements were being negotiated? Is it something that has sort of tailed off the larger and more unwieldy it has become?
Shall I try and answer those questions?
Yes, please.
Yes, you're quite right about unilateral free trade. These are tricky issues. I'll try and keep it simple. I would not myself advocate unilateral free trade as a first best solution. That's to say, where we just drop our tariffs regardless of what other countries are going to do.
Okay, that was my misunderstanding, because I thought you were saying...
That would not be my first best policy. Do I think it might be the right policy under certain circumstances? The answer is yes. I mean, if I concluded that we were going to get nowhere with our free trade negotiations, or get nowhere at least for a very long time,
GLA.
Countries. Now, for instance, we could decide, as and when we leave the EU properly, to drop these tariffs on oranges, as long as we don't have any tariffs on oranges from anywhere in the world, which they're there, of course, to answer Graham's question, to protect Spanish orange producers, aren't they? So that's what I would do. I think that we would do better, probably, to proceed by trying to negotiate free trade agreements with countries around the world, rather than dropping our tariffs unilaterally on everything, although there might be particular tariffs we should drop pretty quickly, oranges being an example. On Trump, I mean, heaven knows what he wants or intends or will do. I think the mood music, this is very difficult to read this, well, he's been very aggressive towards China, and he's made some pretty aggressive remarks about trade with the EU, Germany in particular. At the same time, there have been a number of noises emanating from the White House suggesting various points that a US-UK free trade deal would be on the cards. I can't really judge whether that corresponds to President Trump's current mindset. I don't know. There are bigger things at stake here than just the trade relations. Obviously, there are security and defence relations here as well, and he's entering a spat as well over NATO defence spending. These are very dangerous waters and also quite complicated to analyse. I suspect that were we able to, that's to say, if we'd not signed up to the agreement that was coming, if it was an agreement at Chequers, I suspect an agreement with the US will probably be forthcoming fairly quickly, and we would then probably fairly quickly get agreements with other countries in what you might term the Anglosphere, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Agreements with the likes of India and China, I suspect, would be a lot further down the road, is my guess. Japan might come relatively soon as well, partly for geopolitical reasons. On your question, your third question about numbers of countries in the EU. I don't know the answer to your question as to say, if you did a historical study, would you find that the difficulties got a lot greater as the numbers went up? My suspicion is that 28 is not much different from 22, quite frankly. And actually the original 6, that's difficult enough actually, because you've got particular interest groups, small Italian businesses and manufacturing, particularly with regard to textiles, for instance, French farming, German manufacturing. There's enough there to cause a difference of interest. I suspect it was a big enough problem right at the beginning. And as you get bigger, it gets a bit more complicated, but I don't really think 28 would be, it's particularly, as I say, that much more difficult than 21 or 22.
Thank you. Before I say anything else, welcome Lord Adonis. Thank you very much. I'm sorry you've missed the beginning. But
can I apologise for being late, Chair? I've been speaking to London councils about Brexit. And
oh dear.
I told them I was due to appear before you, so I left early. I'm afraid I couldn't get it.
Well, yes, I think it's a zone.
I should report to you, I didn't read a single one that's in favour of it, by the way.
In favour of what?
In favour of Brexit.
Everyone was?
I didn't read a single leader of the London Council who's in favour of it.
Really?
Not
well, there's an ex-leader. But
that's it, your ex.
If you come to Wandsworth, I think Ravi's in favour.
Yeah, there you go. There you are. Anyway, can I just remind you all, we're trying to more look at the effects of whatever we come to on London. So if we try and keep it slightly less, because I think we could speak about this for a week and still not finish a conversation. Caroline was coming in, and then Andrew.
Well, that's exactly where I was heading. Roger, you mentioned the idea of having completely tariff-free trade, and I wanted to understand from you and from Ben what the impact on London business people, London traders and Londoners would be of going to a tariff-free trade situation. So Roger, if you'd like to briefly...
Well, I haven't looked at the London-specific part of the modelling, and I'm no modeller, so Ben may be able to tell us more about what the model spews out about that. But I'm guessing, as it were, on the basis of first principles, I wouldn't myself think that the impact of the tariff regime would be especially big on London. I'll be interested in what Ben's got to say, but that would be my supposition. For London, the bigger issues, I would suspect, would be the service sector in general, financial services in particular, and in relation to that, of course, the freedom of movement and the access to skilled labour are, I think, the really critical issues for London-specific things.
Yes, I'd echo some of those comments. Just coming back briefly to the kind of what you might call the pure free trade model, where you just abolish or you agree no tariffs on anything. These have often been, or usually been, assessed in overall what we call macro models, which are whole economy models. So they don't necessarily consider the effects on particular sectors, as Graham was rightly pointing out. Tariffs on textiles are, to some extent, there because of small Italian producers, but yet, if you look at the sectors in this country, we still employ over 100,000 people in textiles industry. So you go to them and say, we're going to abolish all tariffs on cheap imports, and it will make it completely free, and see what happens to your industry. So this is the criticism. There is, it's not all roses in the garden in terms of complete free trade, Singapore, Hong Kong type model. You will severely damage some industries, notably the manufacturing ones that have to compete with much cheaper imports. You could argue that will make them more competitive, and this is the counter-argument, but that's a matter of debate and a matter of opinion as to where you put the weight in the argument on that one. But coming back to your point about free trade and specifically the effect on London, yes, I mean. We know that in the UK, most of the economy is now services dominated, and in London, that's even more of a kind of amplified or magnified effect of specialisation in financial services and ancillary services and so on. And these are largely unaffected by free trade agreements in terms of it's the non-tariff barriers that matter, the regulatory issues, and not so much tariff barriers. Obviously, these will affect Londoners in terms of the price they pay for goods that they are imported either from the EU or elsewhere. And there have been recent studies showing that London will actually do better than the rest of the UK because of the types of goods that are produced and the types of goods that are purchased. A couple of recent studies. So there's two things there. One is the kind of sectoral mix in London, which is much more towards services. So you'll get less of an immediate effect from tariffs, and it will be more from non-tariff barriers, which, as has been discussed already, we don't know much about because there hasn't been much talk about these kind of agreements, which I find incredibly surprising, given it's so important to the London economy. Secondly, when it comes to London, and this is being emphasised by specific studies by Philip McCann and Raquel Ortega at the University of Birmingham, London has a much more global outreach compared to many other places within the UK, which rely more on EU trade. Now, this is dependent upon their models and their own calculations and so on, but I think it's fair to say London is much more of an outward-looking global centre than anywhere else in the UK. And so if things go wrong with relationships with the EU, who's going to suffer most? It's not going to be London so much because of the links it has elsewhere in the globe.
Can I just pick up on one thing that you said about if just going back to this no tariff thing that Roger was talking about, you said it might make manufacturing more competitive. Do you think that there is a negative impact risk there for the workers working in manufacturing? Might that competition lead to worse pay?
Yeah. I mean, for those that, there's loads of arguments. This is the whole thing about economics. You always got debate one side or the other. I mean, you can argue that the manufacturers that remain, that aren't decimated from complete free trade, the workers that are still employed in those sectors will be paid more because the companies become more productive because of the trade and the extra competition that they have through access and exposure to more worldwide companies. Again, Graham disputes those kind of competitive trade effects, but again, that's a different debate. But there will be lower employment, or the assumption is in these other models that this employment will go elsewhere. It will be transferred to other areas of the economy. So maybe you get an overall beneficial effect. But there's no right or wrong in the debate.
Can I just come up with that example you gave of textiles? Because there's both a historic and a recent geographic example. In South Africa, recent textile industry was effectively destroyed by China being able to import into South Africa with either very low or no tariff regime, and that wiped out pretty well the textile industry in South Africa. And historically, I'm sure you've all seen them, I recall the films of Gandhi visiting the Northwest cotton mills, arguing about the need for a fairer price for cotton coming in from India. And the net result of that was pretty well to decimate the Northwest cotton trade. So these things have precedents that we can actually see to talk about. But I wanted to actually talk about services here that those come up, because 90% of London's economy is services, and you've indicated between some of the measures of that. And one of the concerns I have about that is the loss of passporting rights into the EU, because if the net result is that each of our financial services or tech businesses, whatever it happens to be, has to set up effectively separate headquarters throughout the EU, that effectively makes them far less competitive and far more bureaucracy and difference of regulation.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll let other people talk.
I agree with everything you've just said. I mean, I think I've come into this late, but all the benefits are theoretical and speculative, whereas the risks to the status quo are huge in all of these respects. And the idea, I mean, Mr. Bootle was just saying that he thought that President Trump might be keen to sign a free trade agreement with us. Well, that's hugely speculative. All we know is what he's said and done. And what has he done so far? He's slapped a 25% tariff on UK steel, a 10% tariff on aluminium. He's said that his intention is to dismantle NAFTA in its current form. He said America first is his policy. He's taken exactly the same approach to other nations, irrespective of whether they are allies or non-allies of the US. I mean, the list goes on and on of his actions in limiting free trade and seeking to put America first. So I don't see any evidence whatsoever that he would adopt that approach. And the US ambassador, I don't know if you saw, Chair, the US ambassador to Britain's comments on the Chequers agreement last week, far from what Mr. Bootle saying would be straightforward. He said that because of the close alignment which we were now proposing to engage in terms of goods and all the standards that go with it, he thought it was now, I think his words were up in the air, didn't he say? Up in the air, whether or not America would be interested in pursuing with any rapidity a trade agreement with Britain. So I think the idea that you should come out of our current arrangements on the speculative gains of a trade agreement with President Trump. And by the way, of course, President Trump may not even have control of the House of Congress after November. I mean, there are elections coming up, and anyone who knows free trade agreements, the interval between presidents agreeing free trade agreements and Congress approving them is huge. I mean, these are hugely speculative issues. The only thing we can be sure about is the potential losses, if we get this wrong, from departing from current arrangements. And the Prime Minister appears to realise that, because what the Prime Minister is doing step by step is seeking to entrench current arrangements in her negotiating position with the European Commission.
Graham, can you comment?
Yeah, but Lord Adonis didn't hear the previous discussion, where I think everyone on the panel agreed that the Chequers agreement would inhibit free trade agreements, and that's one of the reasons why we think it's a very damaging agreement. But actually, you can turn the argument on its head, I think, that Lord Adonis has just made, and said that until the last few weeks, a free trade agreement with the US didn't actually matter that much. The average tariffs in the US about 1.5%, and there are regulatory things we want to overcome, but the regulatory things that they want to overcome that we would be less happy about giving up, particularly in the NHS. But now that President Trump is starting to throw his weight around, or throw the weight of the US around in trade, it actually becomes rather more important. If he wants to have a trade war with the EU, it might be really quite good for the UK to stay out of that.
But what evidence is there that he's going to give us a free pass? What evidence? Is there any evidence? I mean, because you've got to deal in evidence here. There's no evidence at all that he would do so. None at all. None whatever. It's purely speculative.
I've heard Lord Adonis talk about these things before. I think it's very hard for Lord Adonis to see a glass of water without seeing it, half full, quarter full. Everything is always so difficult. Of course, it may be true. Perhaps President Trump won't.
About the TTIP non-agreement, because that, I think, is something that was actually on the cards, albeit preceding President Trump. And that was the negotiation between the EU and America for a mega trade deal. And that collapsed for a variety of reasons. As far as the UK is concerned, I think you're right in saying we were concerned about the impact of private companies taking over the NHS and a range of other things as well. It's not just chlorinated chicken. If the EU wasn't able to negotiate the TTIP agreement, if we tried to negotiate it, presumably we weren't going to get anything better than was on offer. And the TTIP, presumably also, it was something considerably worse because of the differential in bargaining power between the EU and the US blocs, which are more or less, I suppose, equivalent players, as opposed to UK, which is obviously a small part of the EU, but still much smaller as against the American economy.
I don't think you can necessarily assume that for reasons we were talking about before. The oranges sort of situation. I mean, all I do know is that Trump's trade secretary seems to have made positive noises, and we shall see. I just want to make one, I think, pretty important point in response to Caroline's question about free trade. One thing we haven't brought out about the Cambridge Econometrics report yet, it does say that almost under any arrangements, GDP in London would be lower. But actually, it also says, and this received no publicity at all, it didn't actually receive any publicity in the report, but the results of the modelling was that GDP per head, i.e. living standards, would be higher in London under any scenario. And therefore, I think that would also be true if there were no tariffs. I can see Andrew looking sceptical there. It wasn't brought out.
Our voting argument. I think we said we were better off. I think what the actual is we would be less worse off.
No. The report clearly shows living standards would be higher, and the best outcome for living standards in London would be no trade deal. Now this doesn't appear specifically in the tables. You have to compare the change in population with the change in GDP. GDP goes down, but population goes down more, so GDP per head is actually higher. Now that hasn't been brought out anywhere. I think it's terribly important that we put this on the record. The Cambridge Econometrics report says that any form of Brexit, and especially no deal, would be beneficial for living standards in London. Perhaps we could ask Ben just to...
I think what you'll find is it's the hard Brexit scenarios, the 4 and 5, where we impose a much more strict migration restriction. Although, again, we can debate the ability to restrict net migration until the council can have. But there we do restrict population, and London's population comes down more because it relies more on migration and immigration to support that. Whereas on the GDP side, because London has a higher proportion of productive and resilient sectors, which we would expect, and what comes out of our modelling is that they bounce back more quickly from the shock. And this is something which really hasn't been explored at all in any of the studies thus far on Brexit, which is the resilience of places to recover from shocks such as Brexit. They're treated very much as kind of static shocks. Something happens and then it all goes downhill. But London has shown time and time again that it can actually rebound more quickly. It can regroup itself. Yes. And so the GDP aspect and the productivity, sorry, let me finish, does bounce back, but the population does suffer. So you do get, I fully admit, you do get in the, I think it's the hard Brexit scenario, you do get an effect of GDP per capita.
Every scenario for London.
Well, but it's not something I necessarily need to...
The point being, it is a shame that the positives of Brexit haven't been brought out on your report at all. It's more the negatives, which is a shame because I accept that. I'm going to draw a line on this section. If not, we're never going to get beyond this section. Ask you all to ask a very, very quick answer to this next one, and then we'll go on to Andrew's section. So, is the government's plan for EU exit set out in the Chequers statement a good EU deal for the UK? If not, how should it be improved? Now, I accept unreservedly you've only got a little sample of what you think it's going to be. But if I can just ask for a few words from all of you, as Lord Adonis hasn't said much.
I think it would be a terrible deal because it completely excludes services. So, and since services are the overwhelming mass of the London economy, it would be a terrible deal. Also, but I don't think it's a negotiable deal because the boundary between services and goods is so complex that anything short of either a Swiss or a Norwegian arrangement, so either the EEA or a very complex web of bilateral treaty arrangements which get you to pretty much the same place, looks to me to be virtually impossible to negotiate. So I think it's an opening gambit for negotiations, which, if it's going to get anywhere, would actually draw the UK's negotiators closer and closer to Norway, which is clearly, looks to me, what the Prime Minister is intending to do. She's intending to get something like the Norwegian position, but in stages, in order to get an agreement, and that would be necessary to get one. Whether that one is better than the status quo is itself a matter for debate, but the Chequers proposal itself is an opening gambit for a negotiation, which it looks to me couldn't possibly be concluded on anything like that 3-page statement.
Okay, thank you. Can we just ask for the answer for all of that and then come back?
Well, it leads to the simple question is, will the EU accept the Chequers agreement?
No, of course not. And the Commission's already said.
Well, that sort of fits in with
the Commission's already said
okay,
that.
Great.
So it's,
I've got very little to add to what Lord Adonis has just said. It seems a strange and disastrous agreement. And because there's so little in it on services, there's very little in it for London.
Okay, thank you, Roger.
Well, I think for the first and possibly only time this morning, I'm going to agree completely with Lord Adonis. I think what we've got here is a deal that's concocted really for political reasons. It's all about balancing Mrs May's political position. Very few people, I think, from either side of the debate would have wanted an outcome quite like this. As Andrew Adonis says, it excludes services, which is, the bulk of the economy. The Brexiteers, it's a dog's breakfast, and for the other side, it's probably something very similar. And I also agree with him. I don't think the EU is going to accept it. And so this is very much the beginning for the negotiations, or it may also be the end. I think we're probably getting to a position now where the most likely outcomes are one of two extremes. That's to say, we don't leave at all, or we leave without a deal.
I agree with that. I agree with. Can I establish points of agreement? I agree with him completely. I think those will turn out to be. I think those will turn out to be the alternatives.
We've got agreement between each other.
I can add to the agreement. I mean, you could argue good relative to what? I mean, I don't think it's a good agreement at all. It's the worst of all worlds, really. It doesn't really answer any of the camp's kind of particular criticisms. It won't be accepted by the EU, that's for sure. It doesn't cover services, as we've said, so really I think it's more of an academic debate, or as Andrew said, perhaps a starting gambit to further push the UK back towards the EU. But
is there anything in it, gentlemen, very quickly, that is, you thought, deep joy, this is great? Is there anything in it that you think would be a positive? Right, okay, we'll move on. Right, that says it all, thank you.
That was a long answer though, wasn't it?
Right, Andrew's going to come.
Yeah, I mean, we've started on London, which is where we're really, most of the dinner and assembly, I think the most interesting. Obviously, it's the context of the bigger picture. I just want to look at some of the sector-specific impacts as well. I think Ben already said it's a sort of a mixed picture across the range of indicators. I think some of these issues were looked at, but am I right in saying that the arts are particularly affected, the financial and professional services, science, technology, creative and construction, hospitality are the ones that are particularly going to be affected, and in particular hospitality and construction, which is so dependent on migrant workers.
Yes, I mean, as we discussed at the beginning, our results are the culmination of three main effects. One is the trade effects, the tariff and non-tariff barriers, and for London we've already agreed, I think, that most of those effects are going to come through non-tariff barriers onto the service sectors, which again are incredibly difficult to kind of capture in their effects. Secondly, you've got investment effects, notably through uncertainty at the beginning, which we've already seen happening, and also through longer term through foreign direct investment and making the UK a less attractive place to invest. Again, these things are already happening, they're visible in the data, so it's, you can argue one side or the other the causes, but I think the direction is fairly clear. And also you will get investment effects, which what we call induced by the trade. So if trade causes friction in the economy, it will tend to affect output, lower output, and that will lower investment as well. So you get a double effect there. Then you've got your migration effects, and migration of unskilled labour, which often goes into hospitality, construction sectors, and would also skilled labour in the services sectors, which will also affect London. So depending on the sector, you've got different effects coming in. So construction and hospitality, more affected by migration of low-skilled labour, whereas some of the other sectors, higher value added, are going to be more affected by FDI, but also by non-tariff barriers and regulations and migration of skilled labour. So if you look down the sectors and see the different effects, it's not one effect taking place here, it's the combination of all three interacting together, and how that kind of melts together in London.
Can I pick up one of the things that you said about effects already starting to happen?
Mm-hmm.
It's a sort of more general question. Post-referendum, we've seen effects already starting to happen, particularly on foreign work, EU workers coming into London or going back home. What impact do you think focusing on that particular issue, do you think we've already seen? And is that an indicator of what's going to happen further down the track?
Well, yes, you can see effects already happening because I think because of the uncertainty of the situation. And it's largely the same kind of effect that's happening for investment. Businesses don't like uncertainty, and if there is uncertainty, they don't want to invest. And if people don't know the situation they're going to be under in 2-3 years' time with respect to their citizen rights, and whether they'll have to kind of sign visas, it'll be more expensive for them to stay in the UK, and it just creates an atmosphere where, why stay here, why not go somewhere else? So we're already seeing these effects, and the people that are more mobile are the ones that typically at the moment are more skilled. So you're seeing those effects coming in first. But also there are effects on the low-skilled labour where people are not coming to the UK. That's also caused by the fact that sterling's depreciated. So it's actually less beneficial for them to come to the UK. They may as well stay somewhere else or go to other countries within the Eurozone. So you're seeing effects already, and I think those will continue as long as uncertainty prevails and the government doesn't have a proper position on these things. That will at least end the uncertainty and reduce some of these effects. I still think it will create some negatives regardless of what happens as a result of any agreement, but we're seeing the effects already.
Can I just say, because I came in at the tail end of this conversation about modelling, because modelling is always, because there are so many variables, it's always of limited use, but modelling what happens if population declines or as a result of changes to free movement as against GDP. I mean, it may be right that the GDP will hold up even as population declines, but we have had a period of no net migration into this country, or not much, which was between the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1968 and the expansion of the EU to the Central Eastern Europe in 2004. And that was a terrible period for London. I mean, that's the period I grew up in London, when London economy was sluggish, its population was in decline, its public services were in a deplorable state. I mean, the idea that somehow closing the borders, which we did quite effectively then, the 1968 Commonwealth Immigrants Act pretty well closed the borders to new net migration. The idea that this was anything other than negative to the economy of London is for the birds. So you have to be very, very careful what you wish for here. Let's be clear, what's happened since 2004 has been an almost unmitigated benefit to the London economy. Now, it may be that for political reasons, and they're understandable political reasons, there need to be changes to it, but there's no evidence in what's happened since 2004 that, because London's such an extraordinary magnet as a world city to people who are ambitious, whether they've got low skills or high skills actually, but want to make their way. So an extraordinarily successful magnet. Anything that limits that is likely to be damaging to the London economy. Now, there may be good reasons for inflicting that damage, but from the viewpoint of London, the question is how you mitigate the damage, not how you somehow reap advantages from it, because it doesn't appear to me in anything other than the short term, where the economy holds up better than the decline in population, that it's beneficial. And just a final point from, as a historian taking a long view of these things, the cities can rise and fall in their reputations quite quickly. London was not a great and attractive place to come in the 1970s. A set of changes in the 1980s, the creation of Canary Wharf, the Big Bang, the expansion of the EU, Britain being a member of the EU, made London very attractive. But cities can go quite rapidly into decline. Look at the history of Montreal over the last 30 years. Big political uncertainty, is Canada going to break up, and all of that turned Montreal from being what was a world city into being a regional city quite rapidly. Look at the history of Paris over the last 200 years. Europe's capital effectively to being an also ran against London. From the viewpoint of London, which of course is what your committee is concerned about, anything that reduces London's international economic competitiveness, including its attractiveness to highly ambitious skilled and unskilled workers, would, on the basis of what we've seen just in the last 50 years, be very detrimental to the London economy.
Okay, Graham first, then Roger.
Thank you. I love the way Lord Adonis ties the history of London to his favourite themes.
That's what you'd expect of me, isn't it? Because that's what I'm here for.
Increasingly, it is what I expect. But the big thing in the long decline of London until its recovery from the 1980s was of course regional policy. It was the policy of the UK government to take jobs and people out of London to new towns. It's not generally remembered now, but all manufacturing firms had to get what was called an Industrial Development Certificate, an IDC, which was very rarely granted in London. So it wasn't a matter of cost or anything. You couldn't actually get government permission to open a factory in London. The reason for this, of course, was they wanted the factories to go north, to go to Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, the North East, which they did. And the dismantling of that policy from the end of the 1970s reversed the situation. London has since done well, partly for the reasons. I don't think migration wasn't a driver, but the deregulation of finance obviously was. But the other side of that is the disadvantaged regions have done worse over that period. So it just depends the way you look at it. Could you just quickly repeat your original question? Because there was something in that I wanted to come back on.
The impact so far post-referendum, pre-actual Brexit on the London economy, in particular, for example, we've seen the impact of people not coming to the UK, as Ben said, the drop.
Yes.
Yes. Drop in foreign investment.
Yes, I did want to make a point on migration. If you look at the last 15 years, particularly since the opening up to Eastern Europe, what's happened in the UK as a whole, and very much in London, is in the UK as a whole, something like 4 million new jobs have been created. And this is often trumpeted by the government, great success. UK very good at job creation, much better than the rest of the EU. But 3/4 of those jobs have been taken by people who weren't born in the UK. So the business model of the UK has been one of creating large numbers of jobs, the majority of them minimum wage, low wage jobs in the UK, and bringing in millions and millions of more people with all sorts of social and other consequences which aren't borne by the companies that are bringing them in. We can understand why the companies want to do this. The labour force generally is very good and efficient. People work very hard and often rather better educated than the British equivalents, and they will do jobs that the British won't do at the wages being offered. Now, if this flow, particularly the flow of low wage labour, is turned off after Brexit through immigration controls, there will be consequences. I think a number of activities which are currently done, particularly in food processing and agriculture, which doesn't affect London so much, but also obviously in restaurants and catering more generally. Some of that activity is going to cease to exist because the wages will go up. It will no longer be economic, and the UK will start to change. But I think we have to, Brexiteers like myself, have to face up to the fact that there will be job losses. But I think the business model of the UK just is not sustainable. We can't just keep bringing millions of people in from the rest of the world to do low-wage jobs in the UK. If we talk about agriculture, my last point, why on earth do we grow leeks and need Lithuanians to come and pick them? Why don't we let the Lithuanians grow leeks in Lithuania and we buy them from them? You know, it seems like a much more sensible way to run an economy.
Do you think that by decreeing that the Lithuanians can't come here to pick the leeks, that somehow the leeks will they'll all miraculously return to Lithuania and grow the leeks there? I mean, economists don't work like that, do they?
No, but we talk about future flow.
Emissions for transport.
We don't have leaks in London other than from Westminster, but...
No, I said leaks weren't the big issue for London. Construction and hospitality.
Nearly half the construction employees in London are reporting difficulties in recruiting.
Yeah. Companies are going to have to train much more. I mean, that's the big scandal in this. The companies' expenditure on training has slumped since the East Europeans were available. It's cheaper to get good Europeans already train construction workers, train people in all sorts of areas, as well as, of course, in the NHS, doctors and nurses. But this is a big aspect of why this isn't a sensible business model for the country as a whole. It's sensible for companies. Yeah. And one of the things we have to realise here is that the interests of companies aren't always coincident with the interests of the country as a whole.
Yeah, two brief points. First of all, one of the consequences of the Brexit chaos in which the government is enmeshed is that, of course, they haven't properly developed a migration policy. We don't actually know what the migration regime would be, what they want. So it's yet another area, a very important area, where everything is up in the air, frankly. Makes it very difficult for people to plan, makes it difficult for individuals to know what their rights will be, coming, going, and so on and so forth. Secondly, I want to tackle this question of what's good for the London economy. I really think there's a conceptual issue here, and people have to ask themselves some pretty hard questions. What do you mean by the London economy? Now, is it true that the more people who come to London, the bigger the London economy will be? Well, the answer is probably almost certainly yes, assuming that they're working. They're going to be creating some sort of activity, performing some sort of economic task. The London economy will be bigger. And presumably you might want to say bigger equals better. I don't know. So what should be the objective of a body like this? Should you be wanting to maximise benefits for the London economy, such that that means you want the London economy to be bigger? This is a pretty crude way of approaching economic welfare, I have to say. There's another set of questions or criteria you might want to follow. That's to say, should we be asking what's in the economic interests of the existing inhabitants of London? Won't necessarily lead you to the same answer, because it's possible that you could make the London economy bigger by allowing in lots of extra people who work and produce economic activity, but in the process you lower the living standards of the people already in London. Now, you're not bound to, of course. It might go the other way. It might actually mean that you do enhance the living standards of people already living in London, because these people bring valuable skills, blah, 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 blah. They contribute to London's international reputation and so on and so forth. But I must emphasise this very important conceptual question. We must be clear. It doesn't just parrot out, it's good for the London economy. I want to know where the London economy lives. What does he eat? What's the address? I don't know. Who is this person? I understand Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs at 39 Acacia Avenue, Croydon. I understand. So I think we need to be absolutely clear about whose interests we are talking about. And on the question of, doing jobs that British people do or don't want to do, Graham wisely added the rider at the existing wage. One mustn't underestimate the ability of the economy to adapt through the price mechanism. Now, I'm not saying that we should therefore, stop immigration, very far from it. I think it's in our interest, even in the interests of the existing inhabitants, to have a flow of immigrants into this country. But we mustn't just assume that if particular groups of people don't come in, and there's therefore a shortage of workers in that industry, that nothing will change. The economic system adapts, and one of the things that would change, well, several things Graham mentioned, one of them, domestic firms would do more training. The price of that labour that was no longer available would go up. That would encourage more people into those activities. It would discourage the consumption of those things. This is an integrated system. It has to be thought of that way.
Okay, can I just come back on it before Andrew comes in? I can see the logic of what you're saying, but what about public services, which are also being hit by austerity? What about the thing we hear all the time about is care homes who've had problems even paying their way as things stand on the amount we get from government or local authority. What about the NHS, which is reliant on overseas staff? We saw the way the government have actually had to change the rules because of the number of doctors. Long-term they will train more doctors, but the problem still remains all the other workers in the NHS. How are we going to afford to pay them lots and lots more with the overall economic picture?
Well, I don't see how that question bears on what I said at all.
Well, I think if you're talking about the Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs or whatever it was in Croydon, they will want to use the NHS. They will want maybe on care homes in due course. Those parts of the economy in London in particular, not necessarily the rest of the country, but in London in particular, are dependent on overseas workers. And the problem we also have is paying for those services. Now, if the net result is because of the shortage of people, and therefore we have to pay higher wages, where's the money coming from?
Right, look, if I can try and answer that quickly, if I may. These are just particular industries or sectors that fit perfectly well within the framework that I've laid out. Now, if it's the case that, if you want to follow this criteria, by the way, of trying to maximise the economic welfare of Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs, existing in this country already, that welfare is obviously bound up partly with the state of public services, including the NHS. And if it's the case that the availability of those services is going to be hugely impaired by the fact that fewer people are coming in, that's a very powerful factor to put into your assessment of what the economic interests are, right? I'm not saying don't pay attention to it at all. I'm just making it clear, a very important conceptual point, that this concept of the London economy or the economy, what's good for this, doesn't have any economic content. It's flabby conceptually. And I think you have to be very clear about what it is that you want to improve, what you want to optimise.
Could I say, I think it's very, very important to beware of simplistic economic models and causation. This idea that somehow because we have less immigration, therefore our training system will dramatically improve, is not borne out by history at all. I'm a former education minister who spent the best part of 10 years reforming schools in order to improve training levels, particularly on London schools. I was Minister for London schools for 4 years and did a huge amount of work, including with colleagues around the table. Andrew and I, a huge amount to invest in improving London schools. The period where we had almost no immigration, net immigration coming into Britain at all, is also the period when we had absolutely deplorable standards in our schools. Why? Because the markets don't work in these ways. We had very, very inefficient public services, very poor quality of school leadership. We found it very hard because of all kinds of rigidities to attract good high quality graduates into teaching. And London schools in this period were inner London schools were amongst the worst in terms of standards in the country. Indeed, on my tombstone will be written reform of London schools. It was a massive, really difficult and tough job. And it was actually in the period while we had big immigration coming in after 2004 that we also brought about radical improvement in the quality of London schools, thanks to the work of central government working in partnership with the boroughs, where you chair and other members of the committee all come from. So there was in fact a virtuous circle. Actually, as I look at it, because these are complex interactions, the impact of migration into London and very dynamic migrant communities actually, as I look back on it, helped the process of reforming schools, because what you had was extremely dynamic parents, immigrant parents in particular, who were not prepared to accept substandard education and schools, and they, interacting with public service reform and ambitious school leaders and Teach First and a whole lot of other things that were happening, brought about a dramatic improvement in London school standards, which also benefited, perhaps particularly benefited actually, the indigenous London community, who had been so shortchanged by poor school standards before. So you can't make a direct and simplistic connection between low levels of migration and therefore higher levels of training. On the contrary, if you look at what's actually happened in London over the last 50 years, it's the period where we had highest levels of immigration into London that also saw the most dramatic improvements in the quality of training and education in London, particularly benefiting the indigenous population. Second point, if I may, the biggest weakness of the UK training system at large, and I'm afraid this is also true of London, is our apprenticeship system, which we have never yet managed to get right. Now, there are complex reasons for that, and Chair, if you want to, I can give you my views on it, but it has emphatically not been directly related to particular levels of immigration. We had a useless system of apprenticeships before we had high levels of immigration into Britain with the enlargement of the European Union. We've got a useless apprenticeship system now. The interaction has not been straight. The idea that companies were brilliant at training before we had large-scale immigration, I'm afraid, is a complete myth. They were terrible at training before, and they're terrible at training now. I think there's a really important London imperative for continuing to improve the quality of schools. In a report I presented to the London Assembly recently from the King's Commission, which looked at the future of the London economy, one of the two things that we highlighted as most important to the London economy, irrespective of Brexit, is sorting out further education in London. Further education standards in London education standards are far too low, in conjunction with the apprenticeship system. I think that has to be done either way, but I certainly wouldn't say that somehow depressing the supply of immigrant labour to London is going to spontaneously produce big improvements in the quality of company training and educational standards. That is not borne out by the history of London in the last century at all.
we can try and keep it towards Brexit, because if not, we keep understandably veering. Graham, you wanted to comment?
I don't disagree factually with anything that Lord Adonis has
We're forming a strong consensus, have you noticed?
Although I rather love the argument that we need to bring in ambitious foreigners because the dozy Brits won't insist on it.
I didn't put it quite. That was a gross simplification.
I agree.
What you need is really excellent ministers of education who get to grips with public service reform. I think that's the.
I had two nephews at the time who were going to Rotherhithe Primary School, which I discovered had the 7th worst attainment records in the whole UK, not just in London. The schools were pretty bad. And it cost me a lot of money actually to put that right for our particular family. But look, Andrew has just sidestepped the key issue. It is true that company expenditure on training has slumped since the East Europeans became available. It is very hard to get companies to spend money on training. They don't want to spend money if they can get their labour more cheaply, and if there is a supply of labour. This is Karl Marx's reserve army of labour. I thought a labour peer might have some sympathy with it.
I tend not to follow Karl Marx very closely, I should say. When it
comes to I think that's a problem with a lot of the modern Labour Party, but we'll leave that aside. Very hard to get companies to spend money on training, and if they have an alternative route, they will avoid that. I absolutely agree. There's been a huge long-term problem with apprenticeships. And actually, this is relevant to Brexit because Brexit is in some ways a revolt of the working classes, and it's and part of that revolt has been that UK education policy for all of my life, and I'm now in my 70s. All of my life has emphasised universities. It's emphasised really the welfare of the children of the middle classes. And the vocational training system has always been unsatisfactory. It's been reformed time and time again, always half-heartedly. The latest reforms are completely half-hearted. And we need to do something about this. But that's kind of independent of Brexit. We need to do that anyway.
I'll come to that, but just to follow on from that last point about the revolt of the working class, I think it is important to note that London votes heavily to remain.
Not the working classes in London.
Anyway, what I was going to go on to is the question of regulations and some of the assumption that EU regulations are bad and we can do better ourselves and so forth. Maybe something like that. What's your view of the harmonisation of regulations and potential of divergence of regulations, depending on what you will come up with?
Well, of course, the government's position is not to have a bonfire of regulations. Indeed, the Prime Minister yesterday was very clear in the House of Commons that the Chequers Agreement is about high standards of environmental and social regulation. And she said in terms that she doesn't see those standards falling below those which currently apply with directives and other obligations which come from the European Union. So I think that's a theoretical debate. The government itself is not proposing that we start having a bonfire of regulation. On the contrary, it's gone out of its way to make firm commitments that we're going to keep broadly the same regulatory structure when it comes to environmental and social regulation. So though I can see that theoretically there might be some theoretical economic benefit, and I think some people on free market economists take that view, it's not in the real world because it's not going to happen.
This is becoming repetitive, but I largely agree with that. But of course there are some regulations. I mean, in Boris Johnson's resignation speech yesterday, he mentioned one that he's been trying to get lower windows on buses for safety reasons in London buses for ages. Has been slowed down in doing that or prevented by
I'm not absolutely sure that's true.
It's not. There's a press release from Boris Johnson where there is a press release from 2015 where Boris Johnson actually achieved those lower windows and the lorry safety regulations. So he's actually been playing that one two ways.
I defer to your greater knowledge.
Roger.
Yes, briefly on manufacturing. Again, I agree with Andrew on this particular thing. That's to say that it's not government policy to diverge greatly on regulatory standards. That doesn't, of course, mean to say that it's right. Doesn't mean to say that policy is going to stick. Doesn't mean to say that accords with the case for Brexit. As I said earlier on, I think before you arrived, if there is an economic case for Brexit, it rests on a number of pillars. One is the ability to do your trade policy independently, and the other is the ability to diverge on regulatory standards. This is another sense in which, from a pro-Brexit point of view, the Chequers Agreement is really a dog's breakfast, as I described it earlier on, because it is, I agree, the government's approach. Now, on that question of regulation, what importance should be attached to it? Well, first of all, with regard to selling into some export market or other, the EU, for instance, if the UK overall did not obey EU regulatory standards, it would still, of course, be possible for particular industries or firms to comply with those regulations, just as when we export to Australia, Canada, Japan, America, whatever, we have to obey those countries' standards with regard to the goods. That's absolutely normal. I think it's very common for people who aren't economists, dare I say it. I'm not a greatest fan of economists or economics, but in this instance I think there is a great tendency to fall for the idea of high standards being some costless desideratum which must be followed come what may. Regulatory regimes are often imposed as a way of constructing a protectionist barrier around existing producers. They're often just protection by another name. And this is true in the EU, I would argue, quite extensively. So this is a debate we would have to have. Whether we're going to have it or not, I don't know. But certainly in my own case, and I think others on my side of the debate, we're not talking about a bonfire of all regulations. That's clearly ludicrous because we've got to have regulations. The question is, can we do better? Can we construct a regulatory regime for ourselves which creates a better balance between the extreme regulation, I would argue, of the EU and a looser and lighter form of regulation?
Okay, one last question from me about the services sector, which we've talked quite a lot about. And I think it's sort of up to grabs against the moment because it's not in the Chequers Agreement, never mind what may come out the other end. Let's start with Andrew, then we'll work along. Do you think it's important the services sector is able to diverge after Brexit, or is it going to be better to stay aligned with the EU?
Well, what's interesting is to listen to what the representatives and leaders of the services sector say themselves, and they absolutely do not want to be diverging. They have been very clear. Listen to what London First has been saying, and most of its members are the leaders of London's major services sectors. They want to stay, and have been emphatic that they want to stay in the single market, and they want to stay in the customs union, and they're particularly emphatic about the single market, precisely because of the regulatory union which we have, which creates huge new opportunities for them in terms of expanding their businesses, which of course was the reason why Margaret Thatcher went so hard on the single market in the first place. I mean, the history of this is quite significant. The Single European Act, which she signed up to, which is what made possible then the Services Directive and all the moves on this side, were driven by a Conservative Prime Minister in Britain who wanted to cut through massive protectionism, particularly on the part of France and Germany. This is what happened. And it's the reason why she agreed to all the qualified majority voting provisions of the Single European Act, because otherwise it wouldn't have been possible to have got agreement on all these changes. Now, those have been huge gains for the British economy and in particular the London economy, because we're so strong in those service sectors. The leaders of those sectors themselves don't want to see there are particular regulations and things like that which they're constantly arguing about, and quite rightly so, because it's very important that we get these things right. But they do not want to lose their seat around the table, and they do not want to lose the regulatory union. They see both of those, both the loss of influence and decision-making in creating the regulations and the loss of the principle of the regulatory union, which is what the single market is all about. They see those as potential as losses, and potentially very significant losses over time. So the right negotiating position for Britain, in my view, would have been to have achieved, if we're leaving the European Union, to have achieved a situation similar to Norway or Switzerland, whichever it was most possible to negotiate, but and because we're a much, much larger economy, our influence then on the making of the regulations, even though we're formally outside, would in practice, I think, have been reasonably significant. But that isn't the government's negotiating position at the moment. The government's negotiating position is a union in respect of regulations and tariffs on goods, but neither in respect of trade and services. And that isn't what the leaders of these service industries want at all.
So by perhaps Andrew can put me right on this. My understanding was that Switzerland didn't actually have a finance agreement with the EU.
It has a whole set of bilateral agreements.
Yeah, but they don't cover finance. They don't cover finance.
Well, some of them do actually, as it happens,
Well,
but they're not. But it doesn't cover the entirety of their financial services.
Doesn't cover banking, I think.
Yeah, it covers quite a number of aspects of services.
Switzerland doesn't seem to have done just too badly in banking in that situation. There's an obvious danger in tying ourselves to the UK tying itself to EU regulations, particularly in finance and banking. We've been able to mould those regulations in the past with a lot of pressure coming to do things in a very different way on fund management and salaries in banking and so on. Without the UK there in future, there'll be much more freedom for the EU, I think, to do the sort of things it wants to do on finance. A lot of people in the EU don't like finance, and London has been a constraint, or the UK has been a constraint on what they can do. So they're likely to be more antagonistic to finance in future. And it's very important, I think, that we're not tied. If they're throwing an anchor overboard, it's very important that anchor isn't attached to our ankles.
Can I answer? I found a note of disagreement with Andrew. Thank
goodness for that.
As to say, on the importance of listening to the representatives of these trade bodies. These sectors are nearly always conservative with a small c, defending the status quo. I wouldn't be particularly concerned that they're all clamouring to stay in the single market. I think there's a big area of opacity, about exactly what we would do if we followed the Chequers Agreement. That's to say, we were able to diverge as far as the services sector is concerned with regard to our regulations. We don't know what the government would intend and how that would be compatible with what the EU system would allow. Now, there are some particular regulations, for instance, which I think are itching for reform. I won't say abolition. There's the Working Time Directive, for instance, which has had a major impact on a number of bits of society. Arguably, the NHS has been severely affected by this. The Clinical Trials Directive, listen to what Professor Angus Dalgleish says about the impact of that on Britain's position as a country that very prominent in the development of various treatments and drugs. But a whole series of areas where I think whatever the losses will be from being outside the single market for services, and there presumably would be some losses, there is scope to make up for them, but only if we follow a path of some regulatory divergence, it seems to me. If we sign up to losing the things that we're going to lose and then keep everything else the same, then that doesn't seem to me to be very clever.
I agree with that point completely, but the conclusion I draw is it's not very wise to be leaving in the first place.
Yeah, just to follow up. I mean, I agree with many of the comments. I mean, London we know is less Eurocentric than many other places, has been talked about already. So London has already benefited massively from globalisation and globalisation of services, and it acts as a hub. So it will suffer in a sense less than other areas of the UK from the kind of divergence from EU regulations. That's not to say it wouldn't suffer. And I mean, if UK companies were treated the same as US kind of financial companies, for example, treated as third countries, undoubtedly that it's friction that you're adding into the system, which will cause issues. But the uncertainty is on the other side. What new regulations would happen? These are all uncertain things that we just don't know about, and until someone could actually come up with kind of a way of capturing those and modelling those, or putting a scale on the effect of the benefits, the flip side of it, then it's all a bit supposition.
Thank you. Are you happy with that? Leonie was going to ask a question about migration, but it's been...
I think we've covered that one.
It's been covered. Is there anything else on that specific you'd like to ask? No. Okay, we're coming to our final section, which is preparing for a no-deal scenario. Caroline's going to ask questions there.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think we had quite a lot of agreement just earlier about it being whether it was most likely that either we won't leave or we'll leave without a deal. You seem to all be coming to some agreement. The Prime Minister has stated that a no-deal scenario is preferable to a bad deal. So
Did she? When did she say that?
Yeah, a long time.
But she has said it.
She said it about 100 times.
Ancient history.
We know the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the autumn budget said that the government had set aside £3 billion over the next 2 years for the costs of leaving the EU, in addition to 700 million that had already been spent to prepare for a no-deal scenario. We've heard from the report that potentially there could be 87,000 fewer jobs in London, and also that the professional financial services could be worse hit with 29,000 fewer jobs by 2030. And we know that a no-deal scenario would mean, as well as the World Trade Organization rules applying, that businesses would lose their passporting rights, our membership of regulatory agencies would cease overnight, and also that the sort of getting the UK out of the customs union would there would be kind of a lot of bureaucracy and also cost for business to manage that process. So my question is, and I'll start with Lord Adonis, how realistic is the prospect of no deal, and is there any scenario whereby a deal with the EU should be rejected?
This is a really important question, not least because one of the items on the Chequers agenda, which Boris Johnson made something of yesterday in his resignation statement, is that we should somehow up our preparations for no deal. Now, I think that the Prime Minister did a massive disservice to the country and to the debate by saying no deal is better than a bad deal, because what's become clear since, and is now in fact accepted by the Prime Minister and the government, is that no deal meaning no deal, so the actual meaning of the words, that we have no withdrawal treaty with the EU, so we simply leave without a treaty of agreement with them, would be calamitous for the economic and social life of this country. If there is no deal, literally no deal, next March, planes don't fly, there isn't going to be enough petrol in the pump, there'll be 50-mile queues at the port of Dover, and we have to have an immediate erection of border controls between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, because that becomes the external border of the European Union. And the government, let's be clear, has accepted all of that. It's accepted that. It's the reason why I made the 8th of December agreement with the European Union last year, whereby we have agreed, first of all, an implementation period of 21 months where nothing changes at all. That is a deal. I mean, let's be clear, it's a deal. It's why they also agreed the backstop, which is if at the end of the 21 months in December 2020 there isn't then a comprehensive agreement on the economic areas covered by the single market and the customs union. If that hasn't happened, there's this backstop. The backstop is rolling over the implementation period. The big argument with David Davis, which is part of the reason why he resigned, is the government has already agreed that the backstop will not have an end date. Now, those are both deals. The Prime Minister yesterday said in her statement, if you read it, she said that because of the commitments which are treaty commitments that the United Kingdom is liable for in respect of the Good Friday Agreement and Ireland, that it is not possible to have no deal. That is the reason why the 8th of December agreement is in place. And the 8th of December agreement, without which there will be no arrangement on anything else with the European Union, commits us to the implementation period and the backstop as being essential to fulfilling the United Kingdom's commitments under the Good Friday Agreement to having no border, I mean hard border, that is actual customs controls and regulatory barriers and physical controls between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and also the EU Withdrawal Act, that's now law, under amendments introduced in the House of Lords, which the government has agreed to, oblige the government to fulfil the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And that's as a matter of law within the EU withdrawal legislation itself. So this idea that there can be no deal is not the government's policy. It's not actually possible without wrenching and stopping large parts of the economic life of the country and without breaching the Good Friday Agreement. So the issue isn't, and as I say, I think the Prime Minister did a massive disservice to the debate by pretending that no deal was actually possible. The issue isn't no deal. The issue is whether you have what I think is probably best described as a kind of bare bones type deal, which is implementation period, backstop, but not much else beyond that, or whether you have a more comprehensive agreement beyond it. So you have a comprehensive deal rather than a more limited deal. But even that is quite difficult, because I'm a former Secretary of State for Transport. Unless you roll over without any end date the European Aviation Safety requirements and agency and all of that, then planes will stop flying. And it doesn't matter whether it's the end of the implementation period, the backstop or whatever, you have got to have an agreement that goes on beyond that. And for that, you can replicate agreements in all of the areas of economic activity, because, of course, these are all the fruits of 45 years of tying our regulatory and safety regimes into those of Europe. So even there, even when you talk about a bare bones agreement as opposed to a comprehensive agreement, there will in fact have to be a comprehensive agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom, even if we decide to do what I imagine Mr. Bootle would want, which is to withdraw from a lot of the existing arrangements of the customs union and the single market. Even if you do that, you have still got to have a comprehensive agreement dealing with all of these safety, customs barriers and checks and the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, all those sorts of issues. So I think in terms of the committee and what you might be recommending officers, no deal is important to get that out of the debate completely, because there will be no deal scenario. The question is how comprehensive your deal is and how significant the commitments are that you enter into now rather than in subsequent negotiations, which might come in 3 or 4 years' time if you decide just to move the whole thing to the right and have these negotiations during the implementation period, or possibly implementation period plus whatever is the backstop period that you agree with the European Union.
Can I ask, would anyone else like to comment on this?
Obviously, as long as Theresa May is Prime Minister, there's no chance of no deal. That's been obvious for a long time. And the mantra of bad deals and no deals was meaningless right from the start. It's certainly completely meaningless now. The important thing, and I think Andrew brought this out, is to say what we mean by no deal. What economists mean by no deal, whether it's Treasury reports or the Cambridge Econometrics report, is no trade deal.
Exactly.
Now, all the other things, the regulatory things, are terribly important, and we must sign up to something. But Brussels is using threats on this. I mean, you perhaps all saw that Jean-Claude Juncker, was it Barnier, or perhaps working together, forbade the European Civil Aviation Authority even to talk to the UK Civil Aviation Authority about landing rights. So this was a threat. I mean, they admitted it themselves. This was to put pressure on the UK negotiators. I think we should just laugh about these threats, really. Can you imagine a situation where we get to next March and the EU actually says, sorry, your planes can't land, and we say, all right, your planes can't land here. So Americans and Chinese and everybody flying into Heathrow and then wanting to carry on somewhere, so, sorry, you have to get on a bus or something of this. I mean, the reputational damage for the EU in doing something like that would be absolutely immense. I mean, I feel like a spaghetti western here, make my day punk, really. They're not going to carry through on this. So Andrew is quite right. I think obviously we need these agreements. Some are much more complex than others. The whole sort of aircraft industry spat a couple of weeks ago was about these air safety certificates, where again there was a threat, because these were issued in Europe. The threat, and every component that goes into any aircraft, any component made in the UK has to have a certificate, and we all want our planes to be as safe as possible. We said, we just won't sign any of those certificates. I think they went even further and said they would rescind ones that had been issued in the past. So this means planes all over the world, if they happen to have a UK-made component in them, would suddenly have to stop flying. again, it's a completely over-the-top threat that we shouldn't believe. On the other hand, we do need, as Andrew said, we need our equivalent national regulatory authorities. And I think almost no work, perhaps none at all, has gone into setting up a UK air safety regulatory body to replace the EU one. Any such body, by the way, has to be recognised by the whole rest of the world. You can't just sort of set it up and say, well, here it is in an office block. It's a long negotiating process. We should have been doing that for the last 2 years, and we have a problem. But I don't think the EU threats on these things have any real credibility. Of course, we'll have some deal on these things.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with both Andrew and Graham on this. The words are absolutely critical, and this expression "no deal" has been very misleading and I think damaging. The no deal option, as Graham said from an economist point of view, means no overarching trade deal, and therefore it comes to the equivalent of embracing WTO rules. That's what it is, and this is a better phrase I think to use for that specific thing. It's WTO only. That's the rules you're going to do. That corresponds to the economy.
4 and 5.
Yeah. Anyway, but clearly there are a whole series of issues on which we will need to have a deal, umpteen. And so it's been, I think, damaging to conflate these two things together. They are quite different. And of course, the time factor has been disastrous here. I mean, the government has mishandled this appallingly. What is it, 2 years we've been faffing about, and Mrs May staked everything on getting her special, whatever it is, deep and special relationship with the EU, which looks as though it's not going to happen, not going to happen quite the way she intended. Meanwhile, there are a whole host of these nitty-gritty issues which should have been sorted out a long time ago. I think those people who said at the beginning we should have planned for no deal, i.e. no trade deal, are absolutely right. We should have planned for no trade deal and meanwhile got to grips with all these myriad nitty-gritty issues which are actually very important.
Yes, very briefly following on, I agree with that. Our study, in line with many other economic studies, is a no trade deal. It's not looking at the difficulties of barriers in Northern Ireland or between in the Northern Irish Sea or whatever. It can't cope with those. If you're going to go down those routes, you really need to look at an industry-specific study and say, okay, what are the serious regulatory barriers that would happen by a real no deal, and what are the implications of that? And that's well beyond the confines of what we did.
Can I don't want to overemphasise the measure of agreement here. If you have no trade deal, you do have a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. This is a very, very important point. And that's the precise reason why the Prime Minister has not been prepared to say now that is an outcome that she thinks is acceptable. So the government's policy at the moment is complete confusion. On the one hand, she says that that we should up the preparations for no trade deal, but that no trade deal, if it's literally no trade deal, so we're withdrawing from customs arrangements and tariff arrangements and all of the regulatory aspects of the single market, would require there to be a border, a physical border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Well, I've always thought this was the Achilles heel of Brexit. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, who at least has the virtue of being sort of clear and logical in his thinking, what Jacob has said, because I've been doing endless debates with him now, is that the right way of dealing with it for this is for the Republic of Ireland also to leave the European Union and then agree to have our system of trade, regulation and tariffs afterwards. Now, logically, there is a certain virtue to that, but of course it's just straightforward neo-colonialism and it's not going to happen. I mean, I've been in Dublin recently, it's not going to happen. So the big problem I think that Roger has to address is how can you have no trade deal without having a border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland that breaks the Good Friday Agreement. And nobody on the Brexit side of the argument has been able to produce an answer to that yet because there isn't one.
Before I bring Graham to Paul Leone here myself.
I actually just wanted to bring it back. I wanted to bring it back to London because, interested as I am in the esoteric and practical issues relating to the border between the 6 counties and the rest of Ireland is not in London.
No, but we are part of the United Kingdom. This is a key point. London can't declare UTI.
But I actually...
Sorry, on the 6 counties you're referring
there
to...
Are a number...
So when you refer to 6 counties, do you mean Northern Ireland?
Yes, I do. There are a number of people who have suggested that London is... London should declare UDI. I also don't think that's going to happen either. But I wanted to come back to the point which I think Roger was making about the sort of the faffing about issue, because earlier on we were talking about, you know, the obvious impacts that are going to flow from this, and the failures of apprenticeships policies, and the idea that we're going to make changes to migration. Haven't we actually been wasting, and I think some of this is going to have a big impact on London. We've had 2 years. You know, we know what happened in the referendum. It was in June 2016. It's now July 2018. Couldn't we have actually been making quite a lot of preparations for some of these, you know, obvious consequences? It seems to me that if you make these big changes, and I think some of them are going to have quite an impact on London. My background's working in construction. Every building site I go on has all the safety notices in 4 languages. I don't speak Lithuanian, Latvian or Polish, but all the safety notices are in those languages for a very good reason. Now, you know, I can't see why are we wasting all this time on you know, we've had more than 2 years, and I do understand that there's still a lot of argument going on, but I mean, you know, the idea of the no deal. So I mean, you know, assuming that it is all going to go ahead next March 2019, surely preparation is of the essence to all of this.
I disagree. I mean, I wouldn't defend. I don't suppose any of us around here would defend the government's approach to all this. Yeah, I think largely we've wasted 2 years. Graham needs to reply about Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Only a couple of sentences. Sorry, I was formerly a special advisor to the First Minister in Northern Ireland for a number of years, and I've written extensively on the border issue. Obviously, Andrew has read none of this whatsoever. There are ways of tackling this through a range of means. My former boss, Lord Trimble, your colleague in the House of Lords, who you will remember got a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the Good Friday Agreement, agrees on this as well. So perhaps we could have a quiet conversation with him.
Well, a lot of his colleagues don't agree, though. There's a big...
Well, clearly, Lord Adonis, there's a lot of very, very good brains that don't agree on a subject. And this is why Brexit is so complex, because there are so many people with so many genuine beliefs and you know, theories to back them up, and it's all contradictory, which I would suggest is why it is taking the government so long to try and sort these issues out.
So if I could just make one point, the government doesn't agree with Lord Trimble though either. This is the salient point. It's the government's view. You just need to read what the Prime Minister said about this yesterday, that in order to fulfil the terms of the Good Friday Agreement and not to have a border between, I mean, a new hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, that we do need a comprehensive, what the Prime Minister now calls a comprehensive customs agreement, and further regulatory agreements, and that's why the agreement was of the 8th of December was made. So I'm afraid the government doesn't agree with Lord Trimble either on this matter.
No, that's absolutely not true, but it's not London, so...
Okay, let's move on. Another question here. I want to go back to looking at tariffs, but in the context of a no trade deal situation. Earlier, Roger, you were talking about what is the London economy, and do we make assumptions about if it's bigger, it's better? Well, there's been a lot of discussion sort of within this committee and also in the Mayor's economic development strategy about good growth. So that is about thinking about an economy that works for, not just for big business, but works for the interests of Londoners and for people who are working in these different London businesses. So the question is, what is the consequence of any assumptions the report makes about the level of tariffs that would be applied to the rest of the world in the event of a no deal? And in particular, would a no deal scenario bring any benefits to the London and UK, but specifically London because we are a London body here, economies? And maybe to start with Roger and then let the others come in.
Well, I think we've largely covered this ground actually earlier on, and I don't really see major differences between London and the UK as a whole in this regard. The structure of the argument we've laid out. And the first thing to say is that, let's call it the WTO option rather than the no deal, to get confused by all that. That, in a sense, just gives rise to a whole load of questions. Specifically, what is your tariff policy going to be? Okay, you're going to be trading under WTO rules, but which tariffs are you going to choose? And there's, as it were, there's an immediate question and there's an ultimate question. I mean, are you going to, on day one, impose the common external tariff everywhere? So the result of that would be that tariffs on imports from the rest of the world stay as they are now, but the adverse change is you impose tariffs on imports from the EU, which currently, of course, don't bear any. Presumably they're doing the same. I think that's what the day one position would be. Hopefully you wouldn't want it to stay there. And then you've got questions about, are you going to set about negotiating free trade agreements with umpteen countries? Over what period are they going to come to fruition? And then there's also the question, are there particular areas, as I say, categories of good, where you would not want to impose tariffs, in which case you choose what those areas are and you set about imposing them. Now again, you see, I don't think any thought's been done on put into this. And it's a big question if you have the WTO option, i.e. the no deal in that narrow sense, are there particular areas where from day one you should say, right, 0 UK tariffs. Oranges being an example, for instance. Maybe you just don't impose any tariffs on them at all, whether they come from Spain or from outside the EU. There's a choice to be made there. And I don't think the government's done any preparatory work on it.
Chair, can I make a very mischievous suggestion? Because I'm keen to. Which is that Roger and I might agree pragmatically that so poor has the government's planning been on the no-deal scenario that it's that the only course which is in fact going to be practical for us next March is to stay in the European Union. Because even though he might think that there are theoretical benefits to be had from a trade Brexit, because the government has been so poor at doing all of these preparatory steps that there is in fact no practical alternative to staying.
Good try.
Perhaps I should just make a comment and remind you. You're all very good brains, you all have different views, but the very good people of Great Britain decided to leave Europe. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us all to find a way that we can leave, we can talk up London, we can talk up Britain, and that we can make sure that we deliver Brexit, because that is what the good people of Great Britain wanted. Yeah. So there you go, we've both had our comments.
Yes, Chair. I think given the confusion here about what leaving might mean, it's, it does seem that if people voted to leave, they may not have been voting for the outcomes that we've been discussing this morning.
They voted for very many different reasons, as we all know. Today we're just concentrating on the economic view of where we are and what we'd end up with at the moment with a no deal.
So I just have one further question, which is, we've talked quite a lot about what the government, their lack of preparation, but have you got any thoughts on what the Mayor should be doing to support businesses, both the very small micro businesses who are like the engine of London's economy, up through to the bigger businesses, the international businesses, as they try to prepare for whatever may be ahead?
Could I make a comment on that? Because I don't think the Mayor himself, of course, doesn't have regulatory powers or isn't a party to the negotiations. I'm not sure he can do much on that. There is a very important thing I think the Mayor can provide, though, from my experience of what's going on in London at the moment. The Mayor has a very important role in providing reassurance to immigrants into this country, EU immigrants into this country at the moment, that their rights are not going to be taken away next March, that they are not going to be somehow deported or treated unfairly, that they are absolutely welcome, and that we will not tolerate any informal, let alone formal, discrimination against them. And the reason why I think that needs to be said is there's a lot of fear and concern amongst migrant communities as to what might happen. And the Mayor, because he has the bully pulpit and is deeply respected by these communities, my advice to the Mayor would be to be very, very vocal in providing that reassurance, because that hugely matters to our common life here in London and to the families affected, many of whom do fear at the moment that they might be adversely affected, both immediately as well as over the medium term, by withdrawal from the European Union next March.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, I agree with that, although of course there's a limit to what the Mayor can say to give reassurance, because we don't know what the regime's going to be. We wouldn't want him to give assurance that proves to be misleading. But I agree absolutely with the sentiment. There is something I think the Mayor can do. I mean, throughout this discussion today, we've talked a lot about, London, the UK, what's the London interest, and I think most of these things, and most of these issues, the London interest is the same as the national interest, and there's a limit to the extent to which we can diverge. There's an area over which the Mayor has got some leverage, which I think is absolutely critical. He should stick to his knitting, as to say, continue to ensure that London is a very attractive place to live and do business. And this involves the transport system, crime. So, at the moment, one of the things that's really detracting from the attractions of London is the appalling situation of traffic in this city, which I would, to make a controversial remark, has something to do with the policy of his predecessor. And I think there is room for improvement without dismantling the whole thing. There area for improvement. Crime, again, very adverse publicity for London in this regard over quite some time. So my advice would be to avoid all the highfalutin stuff over which he's got no power, stick to the knitting, make London an even better place to live and work than it currently is.
So the Mayor should really mind his own business on Europe and concentrate
I
on
wouldn't quite say mind his own business, but I mean, there's a limit to what he can do. So use his limited energy on the things
London's
that
a great place to live and work.
I think second that, I think as a kind of figurehead role for the London economy, I think what I've written out is to echo Roger's comments on transport making the city work, and presenting the image of London being still open for business and active, and kind of doing what he does, visiting different places around the world, and kind of not necessarily forging trade deals, he's going to do that yet, but I mean just keeping doors open and ready to go, and lobbying for things like skills and training to support the friction that will inevitably occur in whatever deal does emerge.
So because I will constantly want to try and sort of push the envelope out, could I also make a suggestion that the Mayor should now support the great majority of the House of Commons in expanding Heathrow Airport, which is hugely important to the London economy, and that he shouldn't be funding at great expense to London taxpayers legal actions against a majority of now nearly 300 in the House of Commons that is clearly not going to be reversed, which includes a majority of the members of all parties except for Caroline's. That being the case, the sooner we get on with this and provide the economic benefits that can come from significantly expanding the number of destinations that can be served directly by London, the better for London in terms of its competitiveness, and the less of London's scarce resources that will be wasted on lawyers.
Come back on that, Chair.
He does have a great many of his residents that he is supposed to be representing, saying that the Assembly is unanimous about it, and you can relate that to Brexit in a sense as MPs should listen to their constituents, and when the vast majority of them say they want to leave Europe, they should make sure that it happens.
Sorry, can I come back on the airport thing as well?
It's not the case that the majority of Londoners are against the expansion of Heathrow Airport. I say there's no evidence for that whatsoever, Chair. None.
There is a huge impact on the health and well-being of Londoners from Heathrow, but the increase in flights is to do with leisure flights, it's not to do with business flights. And there's a lot of spare Eurostar capacity that could be better used.
It's okay, after we leave, nobody will land there anyway. So
that's right, because no planes will be flying.
Did you have a chance to answer that final question on what the Mayor could do?
Yeah, so I have nothing substantive to add, but can I just say, as someone who doesn't live in London, I'm enormously impressed every time I do come to London, just what a dynamic and lively city it is. And obviously I agree with Roger for the Mayor to keep it that way. It's a great city, and it will thrive under almost any conditions, I think.
It is indeed a great city. We're very lucky, those of us that live in it, and we should talk the city up the whole time, not say terrible things, doom and gloom, should we, or when we rather, leave Brexit. Is there anything else any of you have?
One small point on not no deal, and that is we should also bear in mind policeman security. We heard about this last week, not for the first time, from the Metropolitan Police Commission or the Police and Crime Committee, and that has to be part of some sort of deal.
Yeah, that's fine. That's a valid point. Is there anything any of you would like to say that you haven't
I've got
had
one quick point to make. I think throughout this morning's proceedings, we haven't really, on almost any issue, drawn a distinction between, as it were, the short-term impact and the long-term eventual consequence. These two things are not the same. And much of what we've been talking about has been, I think, the short-term disruption. Now, I'm not saying that's negligible and we shouldn't talk about it, we certainly should. And there is, I think, because of our poor preparations, quite a lot of scope for substantial short-term disruption. But, we're making a decision, and you're thinking about the position of London over decades to come. These two things aren't the same.
That's a very valuable, thank you. Anybody else? Any comments? Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for participating. It's very interesting. It's very, very complex. It's no wonder we're floundering a bit at the moment, but I'm sure we'll get there. And please, the majority.
We'll get somewhere, but where is it?
Let's be optimistic.
Finally, can I ask the committee to note the reporting subsequent discussion and delegate authority to me as chair and consultation in consultation with party group lead members to agree an output from this discussion. Thank you. I can ask the committee to note the work programme and priorities of 2018-19 as set out paragraphs 4.2 to 4.7 of the report, and agree to bring forward discussions on preparing London for Brexit. Oh, no, that's the wrong bit. Yeah. The next meeting, that's a mistake. The next meeting is on the 12th of September 2019 at 2 o'clock in the chamber. There's no other urgent business, so that concludes the meeting.
Good fun.